The winter of 1932 arrived in Millbrook County with a cruelty that old-timers would remember for decades. Snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets across the farmlands of rural Pennsylvania, burying fence posts and transforming the landscape into an endless white desert. The wind howled through bare oak trees like the screams of something ancient and hungry, rattling the windows of farmhouses scattered across miles of frozen earth. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there, the kind that made people lock their doors early and avoid looking too long at the darkness beyond their property lines. Hartwell Road cut through this desolation like a scar, a narrow dirt path that connected the outer farms to the small town of Millbrook, population 847. Most of the farmsteads along this road had been there since before the Civil War, passed down through generations of families who knew the land, who understood its moods and seasons. But there was one property that stood different from the rest. Different in a way that made people uncomfortable, though few could articulate exactly why. The Hartwell farm sat at the end of the road, where civilization seemed to give up entirely. A sprawling 200-acre property that had once been prosperous, perhaps even grand, now stood in eerie stillness. The main farmhouse, a two-story structure with a wraparound porch and Gothic windows, loomed against the grey winter sky like something from a fever dream. Paint peeled from its walls in long, diseased strips. The porch sagged in the middle, its wooden planks warped and split. But it was the barn that dominated the property, a massive structure of weathered redwood and rusted metal that seemed to lean slightly to the left, as if listening to whispers from the frozen ground. The farm belonged to the Fletcher family, or had belonged to them. No one in Millbrook could quite remember when they'd last seen any of the Fletchers in town. Post-war America in the early 1930s was not the land of plenty that propaganda posters promised. The Great Depression had its teeth sunk deep into the nation's throat. Banks had failed. Savings had evaporated overnight. Farms across the country were being foreclosed on, their owners turned into wandering ghosts on their own land. Millbrook County was no exception. Neighbors who had once helped each other with harvests now viewed each other with suspicion, wondering who might be desperate enough to steal, to lie, to do worse. But even before the economic collapse, Millbrook had always carried an undercurrent of something darker. The town had been built on land that the Lenape people had considered cursed, refusing to establish permanent settlements there. During the 1800s, there had been whispers of cult activity in the surrounding forests, of strange rituals performed by firelight. 3 children had disappeared in 1889, never found. A traveling preacher had been discovered hanged from a bridge in 1901, though his death was ruled a suicide despite his hands being bound. The town had learned to keep its secrets close, to not ask too many questions about things that didn't directly concern you. This unspoken rule became especially important when it came to the Fletchers. Thomas Fletcher had purchased the farm in 1895 for a price that raised eyebrows even then. Too cheap, people said, as if someone was desperate to be rid of the place. He was a stern man in his 40s, with a face carved from granite and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He wore dark suits even when working the fields, and he never attended church, which in 1895 Millbrook was practically an admission of moral corruption. Thomas had arrived with a wife, Margaret Fletcher, a pale, thin woman who spoke so softly that people had to lean in to hear her, and who always seemed to be apologizing for her very existence. She had large, dark eyes that darted nervously, like a rabbit sensing the hawk's shadow. The few times she came to town, she kept her gaze fixed on the ground, her hands folded tightly in front of her chest. They had 5 children, born in quick succession: Sarah, the eldest, born 1896, Daniel, 1898, Emma, 1900, Joseph, 1902, and Rebecca, 1904. The children were rarely seen in town. When they did appear, usually for supplies that Thomas couldn't grow or make himself, they moved in a tight cluster, silent and watchful. They wore clothes that seemed handmade, often patched, always dark colors: blacks, grays, deep browns. The girls kept their hair pulled back severely. The boys had their heads shaved close to the scalp. What struck people most was their eyes. All the Fletcher children had the same look, a kind of hollow awareness, an old expression that didn't belong on young faces. They never played. They never laughed. They never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, their answers came in whispers, heads bowed. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, remembered young Emma Fletcher coming in alone once in 1908. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She was buying kerosene and candles, Mrs. Henderson told her husband that night. And when I asked her how her mother was doing, she just stared at me. Didn't blink, didn't move. Just stared with those dark eyes. And then she said, "Mother doesn't come out of her room anymore." Just like that. Then she took the supplies and left. Thomas Fletcher himself became even more reclusive as the years passed. He would come to town perhaps once every few months, his wagon loaded with produce to sell or trade, potatoes, turnips, occasionally a slaughtered pig. He spoke to no one beyond what was necessary for business. People noticed that he seemed to age rapidly. By 1920, though he would have been only in his 60s, he looked ancient, his skin hanging loose on his frame, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. And then, in the winter of 1932, they simply weren't there anymore. It started with the milk delivery. Charlie Reeves, a 23-year-old who worked for the Millbrook Dairy Cooperative, had a route that included the outer farms. Every Tuesday and Friday, he would drive his truck along Hartwell Road, dropping off fresh milk and picking up the empties from the previous delivery. The Fletcher farm was his last stop, always had been. Thomas Fletcher had a standing arrangement, 2 gallons a week, paid for a month in advance. On Tuesday, January 12, 1932, Charlie pulled up to the Fletcher property at his usual time, around 4:30 in the afternoon. The winter sun was already setting, casting long purple shadows across the snow. He remembered later that something felt wrong immediately, though he couldn't have said what. The house was completely dark. No smoke from the chimney, which was unusual given the bitter cold. It was 15 degrees, and snow was still falling lightly. Charlie knocked on the front door, his knuckles echoing in the stillness. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, calling out. Nothing. He walked around to the side door, the one that led into the kitchen. The door was unlocked. It swung open when he tried the handle. "Mr. Fletcher," he called into the darkness. "It's Charlie from the dairy. I've got your milk delivery." The house swallowed his words. The silence that came back at him was absolute, oppressive. It was the kind of silence that had weight, that pressed against your eardrums and made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. Charlie didn't go inside. Something in his gut told him not to. He left the milk bottles on the porch, picked up the empties from the previous week, still sitting there untouched, the milk inside frozen solid and expanded, cracking the glass, and drove away faster than he probably should have on the icy road. On Friday, he returned. The bottles he'd left on Tuesday were still there, now buried under 3 inches of fresh snow. Still no smoke from the chimney. Still no lights. Still that terrible watching silence. This time, Charlie reported it to Sheriff William Garrett. Sheriff Garrett was a practical man who had little patience for hysteria or wild speculation. At 56, he'd been the law in Millbrook County for nearly 20 years, and he'd seen his share of tragedy, suicides during the Depression, domestic disputes that turned violent, the occasional drifter who caused trouble. But he'd also learned that most mysteries had mundane explanations. People got sick. People moved away without telling anyone. People fell on hard times and were too proud to ask for help. They probably went to stay with relatives, he told Charlie. Happens all the time these days. Can't afford to heat that big house, so they close it up for the winter. But Charlie wasn't satisfied. "Sheriff, with respect, Thomas Fletcher doesn't have relatives. Or if he does, no one's ever heard him mention them. And would he really leave without telling anyone? Without canceling his milk delivery?" The sheriff sighed. He didn't want to drive all the way out to Hartwell Road in this weather. But the young man had a point. "I'll check on them Saturday," he said. "If they're gone, they're gone. If they're there and just want to be left alone, we'll leave them alone." Saturday, January 16, 1932, Sheriff Garrett drove out to the Fletcher farm. He brought along his deputy, Frank Morrison, a nervous young man of 25 who had only been on the job for 6 months. The afternoon was clear but brutally cold. The wind had swept most of the snow off Hartwell Road, revealing the frozen mud underneath, rutted and treacherous. As they approached the property, Deputy Morrison felt his stomach tighten. "Sheriff," he said, "does this place feel wrong to you?" Garrett didn't answer immediately. He was feeling it too. That instinctive animal response that every human being carries buried in their DNA. The one that screams danger when the rational mind hasn't yet identified the threat. The farm seemed to crouch under the gray sky, waiting. They parked in front of the house. Both men got out, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Garrett tried the front door, locked. They walked around to the kitchen door, the same one Charlie had found open. It was closed now, but still unlocked. "Mr. Fletcher?" Garrett called out, pushing the door open. "This is Sheriff Garrett. We're here to check on you and your family. If you're home, please respond." The kitchen was freezing, as cold inside as it was outside. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a table set for a meal that had never been eaten. 7 places, 2 at each end, 3 along one side. Plates, forks, knives, empty glasses. A pot sat on the cold stove, its contents frozen solid. When Garrett pried off the lid with his knife, he found what looked like stew, potatoes, meat, vegetables, all suspended in ice. "They left in the middle of preparing dinner," Morrison whispered. They moved through the house, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. Every room told the same story. Life interrupted suddenly, frozen in time. Beds unmade, clothes still hanging in closets. Personal items, a hairbrush, a Bible, children's toys, all exactly where they'd been left. In what appeared to be Margaret Fletcher's room, they found her wedding dress still hanging in the wardrobe, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. But no people, no bodies, no sign of struggle, just absence. "Check the barn," Garrett said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. The barn loomed before them, its massive doors closed, but not locked. Morrison pulled one door open, the hinges screaming in protest, and both men stopped dead in their tracks. The smell hit them first. Not rot, not exactly, but something organic and wrong, something that had been sealed inside the barn for too long. Sweet and metallic and faintly chemical, like formaldehyde mixed with old meat, and something else they couldn't identify. Inside, the barn was cavernous and dark. Their flashlights seemed to barely penetrate the shadows. They could make out the shapes of farming equipment, empty animal stalls, hay bales stacked along one wall. And at the far end, something covered by a large canvas tarp. Neither man wanted to approach it. Neither man wanted to know what was underneath. But duty demanded they look. Duty, and the certain knowledge that whatever had happened to the Fletcher family, the answer was here, in this barn, waiting in the darkness. Sheriff Garrett reached the tarp first. His hand, he would later tell his wife, was shaking. He grabbed a corner of the heavy canvas and pulled. What he saw in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. He stumbled backward, his flashlight falling from his hand and spinning across the floor, its beam cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Deputy Morrison rushed forward, then stopped, his face draining of all color. He turned and vomited into the hay. Neither man spoke. They couldn't. Because what they had found in that barn wasn't just a tragedy. It wasn't just death. It was something else entirely. Something that would remain unexplained for nearly 90 years. Something that, when the authorities finally arrived to investigate fully, would raise more questions than it could ever answer. And the most disturbing part? They were all there. The entire Fletcher family, Thomas, Margaret, Sarah, Daniel, Emma, Joseph, and Rebecca, all 7 of them. But how they were found, and in what state, would become one of the darkest mysteries in Pennsylvania history. Sheriff William Garrett would never be the same man after that Saturday afternoon. In the weeks and months that followed, people in Millbrook noticed the change, how he'd stopped sleeping properly, how his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking, how he'd started drinking whiskey at noon. His wife, Dorothy, would wake in the night to find him sitting by the window, staring out at nothing, his face pale and hollow in the moonlight. When she'd ask him what was wrong, he'd simply shake his head and say, "You don't want to know, Dorothy. Trust me, you don't want to know." Deputy Frank Morrison fared worse. He resigned from the police force 3 weeks after the discovery and left Millbrook entirely. Some said he moved to Ohio. Others heard he'd gone further west, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and Hartwell Road. Before he left, he told his brother something that would circulate through the town in whispers. They were arranged, all of them, like someone had posed them, like they were waiting for something. The official investigation began on Sunday, January 17, 1932. State police arrived from Harrisburg, along with a medical examiner from Philadelphia, Dr. Raymond Ashford, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles who had examined bodies from mining accidents, industrial disasters, and murder scenes across Pennsylvania. He had seen death in all its forms. But nothing had prepared him for what waited in that barn. The scene was photographed extensively, though most of those photographs would later disappear from official records. Only a few copies survived, locked away in private collections and police archives, marked with warnings that viewing them required psychological clearance and a documented need to know. Those who did see them reported the same reactions: immediate nausea, nightmares that lasted for months, an overwhelming sense that they had witnessed something fundamentally wrong, something that violated the natural order of reality itself. The Fletcher family had been arranged in a circle in the center of the barn floor, not sitting, not lying down, but positioned upright, supported by a framework of wooden posts and wire that had been carefully constructed to hold each body in place. They faced inward, toward the center of the circle, as if watching something, or waiting for something, that existed in the empty space between them. Thomas Fletcher stood at what would be considered the head of the circle, his position slightly elevated on a small platform. His body had mummified in the cold, dry air of the sealed barn. His skin had turned a dark leather brown, stretched tight over his skull, his lips pulled back to reveal yellowed teeth in a permanent grimace. His eyes were gone. Whether they had decomposed or been removed was impossible to determine, leaving empty sockets that seemed to stare with more intensity than living eyes ever could. He wore his black suit, the same one people remembered him wearing in town. His hands were positioned in front of his chest, palms pressed together as if in prayer. But when Dr. Ashford examined them more closely, he found that the fingers had been deliberately broken and reset, bent at unnatural angles to form symbols that no one could identify. Margaret Fletcher was positioned directly across from her husband. She wore a white dress that might have been her wedding gown, now yellowed and stained with substances that forensic analysis could never fully explain. Her head was tilted back at a severe angle, her mouth open wide, wider than should have been anatomically possible. Later examination would reveal that her jaw had been dislocated and broken to achieve this position. Inside her mouth, investigators found something that made even the hardened state police officers step back in horror: dozens of small bones, later identified as finger bones from children, arranged in a specific pattern. None of them belonged to the Fletcher children. Their origin was never determined. The 5 children surrounded their parents in a smaller inner circle. Sarah, the eldest at 36 years old, stood to her father's right. Daniel, Emma, Joseph, and Rebecca completed the circle, spaced evenly. All of them wore simple dark clothing. All of them had the same empty eye sockets. All of them had their hands positioned in strange, ritualistic gestures. Emma's hands were clasped behind her back, but when they removed her body from the wire framework, they discovered her fingers had been woven together in an impossible knot, the bones broken and intertwined like a basket weave. Young Rebecca, who would have been 28, had her arms crossed over her chest, but her forearms had been twisted 360 degrees, the bones shattered and healed in a spiral pattern that suggested this had been done over time, deliberately, systematically. But the positions and the mutilations, as disturbing as they were, weren't what broke Sheriff Garrett and Deputy Morrison. It wasn't what made Dr. Ashford request a psychiatric evaluation after completing his examination. It wasn't what caused 3 of the state police investigators to transfer to different departments and refuse to ever speak about the case again. It was their faces. All 7 members of the Fletcher family were smiling. Not the peaceful smile of death, not the grimace of rigor mortis, but genuine smiles, lips curved upward, cheeks raised, the muscle structure preserved in expressions of pure, ecstatic joy. The kind of smile you'd see on a child's face on Christmas morning. The kind of smile that comes from experiencing something wonderful, something transcendent. What could make a family smile like that as they died? What could they have been seeing or believing that would cause such expressions of happiness even as their bodies were being mutilated and arranged like dolls in a grotesque tableau? Dr. Ashford's preliminary examination raised more questions than answers. Determining time of death was nearly impossible due to the preservation conditions in the barn, but based on the state of decomposition, the presence of certain insects, and the temperature records for the region, he estimated they had died sometime in late November or early December of 1931, roughly 6 to 8 weeks before their discovery. This matched with witness accounts. Mrs. Henderson at the general store remembered Thomas Fletcher coming in for supplies in mid-November. That was the last confirmed sighting of any family member. But the cause of death? That's where things became truly inexplicable. There were no signs of violence in the conventional sense. No gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no evidence of poisoning in the tissue samples. No trauma to suggest they'd been struck or strangled. Their bodies showed no defensive wounds, no indication they'd struggled or fought. In fact, except for the deliberate post-mortem mutilations and positioning, the bodies appeared almost peaceful. It's as if they simply decided to stop living, Dr. Ashford wrote in his official report. As if they willed their hearts to stop beating and their lungs to stop drawing breath. But that's impossible. People don't die that way. People can't die that way. The barn itself offered few additional clues, but what it did reveal deepened the mystery exponentially. The walls were covered in markings, symbols carved into the wood with what appeared to be a crude knife or sharp tool. The symbols weren't random. They followed patterns, repeated sequences, a language or code that no one could decipher. Linguists from the University of Pennsylvania examined photographs of the symbols and confirmed they didn't match any known alphabet or symbolic system, not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, not any Native American pictographic tradition, not any occult or mystical tradition documented in Western esotericism. In the center of the circle where the family had been arranged, the dirt floor showed signs of intense heat. The earth was blackened and hardened, almost glass-like in places, as if exposed to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But there was no evidence of a fire. No ash, no burned materials, no scorch marks on the wooden barn structure. Just this circle of superheated earth, approximately 6 feet in diameter, directly beneath where the bodies had been positioned. Investigators found candles, hundreds of them, arranged in concentric circles around the main scene. Most had burned down completely. A few remained partially intact, their wax pooled and hardened in bizarre formations. Chemical analysis of the candle wax revealed unusual compounds: animal fat, human tissue. Later DNA testing in the 1990s would confirm it was from the Fletcher family themselves, and plant materials that included several toxic species: hemlock, nightshade, oleander, and something else that botanists couldn't identify, a plant that didn't match any known species in North America. Against one wall of the barn, investigators discovered what appeared to be a makeshift altar. A wooden table held more candles, a large leather-bound book with pages covered in the same indecipherable symbols found on the walls, and 7 wooden boxes, each one labeled with a family member's name carved into the lid. Inside each box were personal items: locks of hair, teeth, fingernails, pieces of clothing, and small vials of what appeared to be blood. Each box also contained a folded piece of paper with a date written on it. The dates ranged from 1896 to 1904, the birth years of the 5 children, and what appeared to be significant dates for Thomas and Margaret. The leather-bound book became a centerpiece of the investigation. Despite extensive analysis, no one could translate it. The writing system appeared consistent and deliberate, definitely not random scribbles, but it matched no known language. Some pages contained diagrams, human figures in various positions, astronomical charts showing star patterns that didn't match the night sky of any time period, anatomical drawings with annotations in the mysterious script, and something that looked disturbingly like a calendar counting down to a specific date, January 12, 1932. The date Charlie Reeves first noticed the house was dark. By late January, word of the discovery had spread beyond Millbrook, despite the authorities' attempts at discretion. Reporters from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh descended on the small town. The story appeared in newspapers across Pennsylvania with headlines that ranged from sensational to terrified: "Death cult discovered in rural barn," "Family of 7 found in ritual suicide," "The Hartwell horror, what drove them to madness." But the newspapers had only a fraction of the true story. The authorities suppressed the most disturbing details: the impossible smiles, the unexplained heat damage, the unidentifiable symbols, the anatomical impossibilities of the body positioning. They released a sanitized version. A family had died of exposure in their barn, possibly a murder-suicide under investigation. The people of Millbrook knew better. Small towns have ways of knowing things, of passing information through networks of gossip and whispered conversations. Within weeks, everyone in town had heard some version of the truth. And with that truth came fear. People remembered things they'd forgotten or ignored. Old Mrs. Callahan, who lived on a farm 2 miles from the Fletchers, recalled hearing singing in the middle of the night throughout the fall of 1931. Not normal singing, chanting in a language she didn't recognize, multiple voices in perfect unison, carrying across the frozen fields. She'd assumed it was her imagination or perhaps the wind playing tricks. A traveling salesman reported that he'd passed the Fletcher farm one evening in October and saw lights in the barn. Not normal lantern light, but something that glowed with a greenish luminescence, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. He'd stopped his car, curious and disturbed, and had heard what sounded like laughter. Not joyful laughter, ecstatic laughter. The kind that comes from madness or religious fervor. He'd driven away quickly, telling himself it was none of his business. 3 children from a neighboring farm told their parents they'd seen the Fletcher children dancing in the snow one December night, all 5 of them holding hands and moving in a circle in the empty field between properties. But they were moving wrong, the children said. Their bodies were bending in ways bodies shouldn't bend. And they were singing something that hurt to hear, something that made your head ache and your stomach turn. The parents had dismissed it as imagination. Now they weren't so sure. The official investigation concluded in March of 1932 with a report that satisfied no one. The findings: probable murder-suicide with ritualistic elements. Primary suspect, Thomas Fletcher. Motive, unknown. Mental illness suspected. Case closed. But those who had actually worked the case knew this conclusion was fiction. It was a bureaucratic necessity, a way to close the file and move on. Because the alternative, admitting they had no idea what had happened, that the evidence suggested something beyond rational explanation, was unacceptable. It would cause panic. It would invite scrutiny. It would open doors that were better left closed. The Fletcher farm was left exactly as it was. No one claimed the property. No relatives came forward. The county took possession by default, but made no attempt to sell it. Who would buy it? Who would live there, knowing what had happened? The house and barn were sealed, officially off limits, though no one needed signs or fences to keep people away. The place radiated wrongness. Even driving past it made people uncomfortable, made them press harder on the gas pedal and avoid looking directly at the dark windows and the sagging barn. Years passed. The farm deteriorated. The house's roof collapsed in the 1940s. The barn, somehow, remained standing, its red paint fading to a dull rust color, but its structure intact, as if something kept it preserved, as if it was waiting. The people who had been directly involved in the investigation carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. Sheriff Garrett died in 1945 of a heart attack, though his autopsy revealed a healthy heart. His death certificate noted unexplained cardiac arrest and severe psychological distress in the weeks before his death. His personal diary, found after his death, contained page after page of the same sentence written over and over. They were waiting for something. They were waiting, and it came. Dr. Ashford published a medical paper in 1938 titled Anomalous Findings in Cases of Suspected Ritualistic Death, in which he carefully described the Fletcher case without naming it directly. The paper was rejected by every major medical journal. Colleagues called it unscientific and hysterical. He died in 1952, and his personal files on the Fletcher case disappeared. Some say his family destroyed them. Others believe they were confiscated by unknown parties. The leather-bound book from the barn vanished from evidence storage in 1947. No records exist of who checked it out or what happened to it. The photographs from the scene went missing around the same time. Only copies of copies remained, poor quality and incomplete. It was as if something, or someone, wanted the truth about the Fletcher family buried and forgotten. But some stories refuse to die. Some mysteries burrow into the collective consciousness and wait there, dormant but not dead. And sometimes, decades later, they resurface. Sometimes the past reaches forward and demands to be heard. Because the story of the Fletcher family wasn't over. In fact, it had barely begun. The farmhouse stood empty for 90 years, gradually consumed by vegetation and weather, becoming a local legend, a cautionary tale, a place where teenagers dared each other to approach on Halloween. The barn remained, always the barn, standing against all logic, waiting in the darkness at the end of Hartwell Road. And inside that barn, in the place where 7 bodies had smiled at something invisible, something that had required their deaths and their suffering and their faith, something ancient and patient, continued to wait. Because what the investigators never understood, what they couldn't have understood, was that the Fletcher family hadn't been victims, they had been believers, and their work wasn't finished. 90 years is long enough for memories to fade, for witnesses to die, for truth to become legend. By 2022, the Fletcher farm had transformed from a crime scene into a ghost story, the kind of tale that gets told around campfires and shared on paranormal websites with grainy photographs and exaggerated claims. Most people in modern Millbrook, now a town of just over 1,200 residents, many of them newcomers who commuted to Pittsburgh for work, had never even heard of the Fletcher family. The farm was just that creepy old place at the end of Hartwell Road, the one with the no trespassing signs that teenagers occasionally ignored on dares. But some families remember. Some families pass down stories like heirlooms, carefully preserved across generations. And some families have reasons to remember that go deeper than curiosity or local folklore. Doctor. Sarah Chen arrived in Millbrook on a gray October morning in 2022, driving a rented SUV loaded with equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators of 1932. At 34 years old, she was an assistant professor of forensic anthropology at Carnegie Mellon University, specializing in cold cases and historical crime scene analysis. She had shoulder-length black hair, usually tied back in a practical ponytail, sharp brown eyes that missed very little, and a reputation for being both brilliant and obsessive. Her colleagues admired her dedication. Her ex-husband had called it an unhealthy fixation on death. The divorce had been finalized 2 years earlier. Sarah had spent the last 18 months researching the Fletcher case, ever since she'd stumbled across a reference to it in an obscure 1938 medical journal while researching something completely unrelated. The case had fascinated her immediately, not because of the supernatural elements that internet conspiracy theorists love to emphasize, but because of the forensic impossibilities. Bodies don't mummify in specific ways without explanation. Bones don't break and reset in patterns without force and time. Heat damage doesn't appear without a heat source. There were answers here, scientific answers, and Sarah Chen was determined to find them. She had fought for months to get permission to access the site. The property was technically owned by Millbrook County, but it existed in a bureaucratic gray zone, too contaminated with history to sell, too expensive to demolish, too politically sensitive to ignore. After extensive paperwork, liability waivers, and a promise to share her findings with the County Historical Society, she'd finally received authorization for a 2-week investigation. She wasn't alone. Accompanying her was Marcus Webb, a 28-year-old documentary filmmaker who had approached her 6 months earlier about creating a film on cold case forensics. Marcus was tall and perpetually disheveled, with sandy hair that fell into his eyes, and an enthusiasm that Sarah found both endearing and occasionally annoying. He saw the Fletcher case as potentially the centerpiece of his documentary, a genuine historical mystery with modern scientific investigation. Sarah had agreed to let him film, partly because his production company was helping fund the research, partly because she knew documentation would be crucial for peer review. The third member of their team was James Garrett, 73 years old, retired and living in a nursing home in Philadelphia. He was the grandson of Sheriff William Garrett, and he'd spent decades collecting every scrap of information about the case that had destroyed his grandfather. When Sarah had reached out to him during her research, he'd initially refused to discuss it. Then, 2 weeks later, he'd called her back. "If you're really going out there," he'd said, his voice shaking, "then I'm coming with you. My grandfather left me something I think you need to see before you go into that barn." They met James at the Millbrook Motor Lodge, a small motel on the edge of town that had seen better decades. He arrived in a taxi, moving slowly with a cane, his face weathered and deeply lined. But his eyes were sharp, alert, and carried a weight of knowledge that made Sarah understand immediately that this man had lived with the Fletcher case for his entire life. In his motel room, James opened an old leather briefcase, the kind lawyers used in the 1950s, its surface cracked and worn. Inside were manila folders, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and a small metal box locked with a combination lock that James's trembling fingers opened with practiced ease. "My grandfather never spoke about what he saw," James began, his voice rough. "Not directly. But after his death, my grandmother gave me his personal effects. Most of it was normal. His badge, his service revolver, photographs. But there was this." He pulled out a leather journal, smaller than a standard notebook, its cover stained dark with something that might have been water or might have been something else. He started writing in this 3 days after they found the bodies. It's not an official report. It's something else. Sarah took the journal carefully, feeling the weight of history in her hands. She opened to a random page and read Sheriff Garrett's cramped handwriting. November 3rd, 1932. "The dreams have gotten worse. Every night I see them standing in that circle smiling at me. But now I understand what they're smiling at. They're not looking at us. They're looking through us, at something behind us, something that followed us out of that barn. Margaret Fletcher speaks to me in the dreams. She says, 'We opened the door. We held it open. Now it waits for the next circle to close.' I don't know what that means. I don't want to know." Sarah turned to another page, this one dated December 1934. "Saw Thomas Fletcher today. I know that's impossible. I know he's dead. I watched them bury what was left of him in the county cemetery. But I saw him standing at the end of my street wearing that black suit, his face in shadow. He raised his hand and pointed at me. Just pointed. And then he was gone. I'm losing my mind. Dorothy thinks I should see a doctor. Maybe she's right. Or maybe the Fletcher case isn't closed. Maybe it will never be closed." The final entry was dated March 1945, just 2 days before Sheriff Garrett's death. I understand now. They weren't murdered. They weren't suicide. They were transformed. They found something in that barn, something old, something that's been waiting in the earth beneath Millbrook for longer than human civilization. They fed it with their faith and their suffering and their bodies, and it gave them what they wanted: purpose, meaning, transcendence. But the ritual was incomplete. 7 bodies, but the circle needed 8. Someone has to finish it. Someone will finish it. I pray to God it isn't me. I pray. The entry ended abruptly, the pen trailing off the page. James looked at Sarah with eyes that held decades of fear and resignation. He died 2 days after writing that. Heart attack, they said, but his heart was fine. He just stopped, like someone turned off a switch. He paused, breathing slowly. I've spent my whole life trying to debunk this, trying to find rational explanations. I wanted to believe my grandfather had lost his mind, that the stress had broken him. But then, I started finding other things. Newspaper articles about strange occurrences around the farm. Police reports of missing persons who were last seen near Hartwell Road. Accounts from people who claimed to see lights in that barn decades after it was sealed. And always that number. 7 bodies, 8 positions in the circle, 1 position that remained empty. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite her scientific training, despite her instinct to dismiss anything that couldn't be measured or tested. You're saying the ritual isn't complete? I'm saying, James replied carefully, that whatever the Fletcher family believed, whether it was real or delusion, they died believing it. And 90 years later, that barn is still standing when it should have collapsed decades ago. That land is still empty when someone should have bulldozed it and built condos. And people still report seeing things, hearing things, feeling things that can't be explained. He leaned forward. Doctor, Chen, I don't believe in ghosts or demons or any of that supernatural nonsense. But I believe that something happened in that barn that we don't understand. And I believe that going there, disturbing that site, might trigger something. I don't know what. But my grandfather knew. And it killed him. Marcus, who had been filming this entire exchange, finally spoke up. So what do you think we should do? Cancel the investigation? James shook his head slowly. No. Because if we don't investigate, if we don't try to understand, then the mystery just continues. More speculation, more fear, more people getting obsessed and destroyed by it, like my grandfather. He looked directly at Sarah. But go carefully. Document everything. And if you feel anything wrong, anything at all, you leave immediately. Promise me. Sarah nodded, though part of her, the scientist, the skeptic, wanted to dismiss all of this as trauma-induced paranoia. But another part, the part that had spent 18 months studying impossible forensic evidence, knew that something genuinely unexplained had occurred at the Fletcher farm. And the only way to find answers was to go there and see for herself. They arrived at the farm just after noon on October 15th, 2022, exactly 90 years and 9 months after the bodies had been discovered. The property looked like something from a post-apocalyptic film. The main house was barely recognizable. Walls collapsed, roof gone, just a skeleton of timber and brick being slowly devoured by vines and saplings that had grown up through the floor. Nature was reclaiming it, erasing it, as if trying to heal the wound of its existence. But the barn stood intact. It shouldn't have. 90 years of weather, of freeze-thaw cycles, of wind and rain and snow should have reduced it to rubble decades ago. Yet there it was, its red paint faded to rust brown, its roof sagging but unbroken, its walls weathered but solid. The massive doors were chained shut with modern locks that the county had installed in the 1980s after a teenager had entered and subsequently spent 3 weeks in psychiatric care, refusing to speak about what he'd experienced. Sarah had the keys. Marcus set up his cameras while Sarah conducted her initial survey of the exterior. She took photographs, measurements, soil samples from around the foundation. Everything was professional, methodical, scientific. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not by people but by the structure itself, as if the barn had awareness, as if it recognized her purpose and was… what? Waiting? Welcoming? Warning? She pushed the feeling aside. Feelings weren't data. James remained in the SUV, having made it clear he would not enter the barn under any circumstances. "I've read the reports. I've seen the photographs that still exist. That's close enough for me." He watched through the windshield as Sarah and Marcus approached the chained doors. The locks opened smoothly, as if recently oiled. Sarah made note of that. Strange for locks that supposedly hadn't been opened in years. The chains fell away with a rattling sound that seemed too loud in the afternoon stillness. Birds that had been singing in the surrounding trees suddenly went silent. Sarah grabbed one of the barn doors. Marcus positioned his camera. Together they pulled. The door swung open with that same screaming hinge sound that Sheriff Garrett and Deputy Morrison had heard 90 years earlier. And with it came the smell. Not as strong as it had been in 1932, but still there. Sweet, metallic, chemical, wrong. Sarah's scientific mind cataloged it. Decay compounds, oxidized metal, something organic but unidentifiable, and underneath it all, something else. Something that made her hindbrain scream warnings, even as her conscious mind pushed forward. The interior of the barn was dim, lit only by thin beams of sunlight that penetrated through cracks in the walls and roof. Dust motes danced in the light. The floor was dirt, packed hard, and in the center, Sarah stopped breathing. The circle was still there. The scorch marks, the patterns of heat-damaged earth, still visible after 90 years. And the framework. The wooden posts and wires that had held the Fletcher family in their death poses had been removed by investigators in 1932, but the holes where they'd been anchored remained, 7 positions in a perfect circle, and 1/8 position, slightly offset, empty, waiting. Around the circle, the symbols carved into the walls were still visible, though weathered. Sarah photographed them carefully, her hands steady despite the growing unease in her gut. Marcus filmed everything, his camera capturing details that the eye might miss. "Dr. Chen," Marcus said quietly, "the light is changing." Sarah looked up. The sun was still visible through the roof cracks, but the quality of light in the barn had shifted. It seemed thicker somehow, viscous, as if they were underwater. Shadows pooled in corners with unnatural darkness. And then she heard it. So faint at first, she thought it was tinnitus or wind through the walls. But it grew clearer, singing. Multiple voices in perfect harmony, chanting in a language that hurt to hear, syllables that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly in her skull. "Marcus, do you hear that?" "Hear what?" He was still filming, apparently unaffected. The singing grew louder. Sarah turned in a slow circle, trying to identify the source. But it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls, from the earth beneath her feet, from the air itself. And with the singing came images, not visions exactly, but impressions flooding her mind. The Fletcher family standing in this very spot, but alive, their eyes blazing with ecstatic fervor. Thomas Fletcher raising his arms to the barn roof, shouting words in that impossible language. The circle of earth beginning to glow with greenish light, pulsing in rhythm with the chanting. Something rising from the ground, something formless but terrible. Something that reached out with invisible fingers and caressed each family member's face with what might have been affection or hunger or both. And then the final image, the one that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. The Fletcher family's faces transforming from terror to understanding to absolute transcendent joy as they realized what was happening to them, as they embraced their dissolution, their transformation. They're becoming part of something vast and ancient and utterly alien to human understanding. Dr. Chen. Marcus's voice snapped her back to reality. He dropped his camera and was shaking her shoulders. You were just standing there, staring at nothing for almost 5 minutes. You weren't responding. Your eyes were… He stopped, swallowing hard. Your eyes were completely black. Sarah touched her face, feeling tears on her cheeks, though she didn't remember crying. Her nose was bleeding. She wiped it away with shaking hands. We need to leave, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What? We just got here. We've barely… Now, Marcus, we need to leave now. Something in her tone must have convinced him because he grabbed his camera and they both ran for the door. Behind them, the singing crescendoed into a sound that was less music than reality tearing, a frequency that made the barn structure vibrate and caused Marcus's camera to spark and die. They burst out into the afternoon sunlight, gasping, and Sarah slammed the barn door shut behind them, fumbling with the chains, her hands trembling so badly she could barely work the locks. In the SUV, James took one look at their faces and said simply, "You felt it." Sarah couldn't speak. She could only nod, shaking, her mind still reeling from what she'd experienced. Not ghosts, not hallucinations. Something else. Something that existed in that barn, in that circle, waiting with impossible patience for what the Fletcher family had begun to be completed. They left Millbrook that evening, 3 days ahead of schedule. Sarah's equipment remained in the barn, abandoned. Neither she nor Marcus ever returned for it. The documentary was never completed. Marcus's footage, what little his camera had captured before it died, showed nothing unusual. Just an empty barn with weathered walls and a scarred circle of earth. But the audio captured something. Voices speaking in that unknown language, rising and falling in rhythmic patterns, and underneath them, something else. Breathing. Heavy, wet breathing, like something enormous drawing air through a throat not designed for human atmosphere. Marcus destroyed the footage. He didn't want to, but Sarah convinced him. Some things shouldn't be shared, she told him. Some knowledge doesn't make us better, it just contaminates us. Sarah Chen returned to Carnegie Mellon but couldn't resume her teaching position. She took a medical leave, citing psychological stress, which was true but incomplete. She spent 6 months in therapy, not for trauma but because she needed to talk to someone, anyone, about what she'd understood in those moments inside the barn. Her therapist listened patiently and increased her medication. Sarah stopped talking about it. She never published her findings on the Fletcher case. Instead, she wrote a single report, marked it confidential, and delivered it to James Garrett 3 weeks before he died of natural causes in his sleep. The report was 17 pages long. 15 pages were scientific analysis, soil samples, photographic evidence, historical research, forensic anthropology. All of it inconclusive, all of it raising more questions than it answered. The final 2 pages were different. They contained Sarah's personal conclusions, written in a stream of consciousness style that would have embarrassed her if she'd been thinking clearly. The Fletcher family believed they were opening a door. They believed that through specific rituals, through sacrifice and suffering and precise positioning and timing, they could create a threshold between our reality and something else. Something old. Something that existed before humans, before civilization, before consciousness, as we understand it. They were right. I don't know what they summoned or contacted or became part of. I don't know if it's an entity or a force or a dimension or something for which we have no words. But it's there, in that barn, in that circle. It's been there for 90 years, and it will be there for 90 more, and 90 after that, until someone completes what the Fletcher family started. The 8th position in the circle remains empty. The ritual remains unfinished. And that thing, whatever it is, waits with patience that makes geological time seem rushed. My recommendation: burn the barn. Burn it, salt the earth, bulldoze the entire property, pave it over, and never speak of it again. But I know that won't happen. Because people are curious, because people need answers, because someone, eventually, will go back there and try to understand. And when they do, they'll find what the Fletchers found. And they'll smile the same smile, and the circle will be complete. God help whoever that person is. The Fletcher farm still stands today, as you read these words. The barn endures, impassable and patient. Millbrook County maintains the property, keeps it locked, posts warnings. But every few years someone tries to enter. Urban explorers, paranormal investigators, true crime enthusiasts who've heard the stories and want to see for themselves. Most leave disturbed but unharmed. A few require psychiatric treatment. And some, not many, but enough to notice if you're paying attention, don't leave at all. They enter the barn and simply don't come out. Search parties find no trace, no bodies, no evidence of foul play, just empty barns and empty circles and questions that have no answers. In 2024, the county proposed demolishing the structure. The Historical Society protested. Legal battles ensued. The barn remained standing. It always remains standing. Because the Fletcher family's work, begun in the autumn of 1931 and completed in their deaths that winter, wasn't finished. 7 positions filled, 1 position empty. A door opened but not fully breached. A threshold created but not crossed. An invitation extended but not yet accepted. And in the darkness of that barn, in the silence that isn't quite silence, something ancient and patient and utterly inhuman continues to wait. Not with malevolence, not with hunger, but with the absolute certainty that eventually, inevitably, someone will come. Someone will stand in that 8th position. Someone will complete the circle. Because some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. They can only be walked through. The last known photograph of the Fletcher farm was taken by a drone in October 2024, exactly 92 years after the bodies were discovered. The image shows the collapsed house, the overgrown property, and the barn, still standing, its shadow stretching long across the earth in the afternoon sun. If you look closely at the photograph, and you have to look very closely, zooming in until the pixels begin to break down, you can see something in the barn doorway, a shape, dark against the darkness inside. It might be a shadow. It might be a trick of light and resolution, or it might be someone standing there, someone in a black suit, someone waiting, someone smiling. If you find yourself driving through rural Pennsylvania, through counties where the roads are narrow and the towns are small and the land remembers things that should have been forgotten, you might see a sign for Hartwell Road. You might see a turnoff marked Private Property, No Trespassing, Keep Driving. Some stories are meant to remain unfinished, some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. And some doors are meant to stay closed, even when they're standing open, waiting, patient as stone, certain as death, for the 8th person to complete the circle. Don't be that person. Please, don't be that person.